Hi, I'm Bronwyn Williams, and we're back with a small print. And today my guest is Nick Hedley. As always on the show, we ask our guests to introduce themselves the way you'd like to be introduced. So who are you, Nick, and what do you do?
Hi, Bronwyn. Thanks so much for having me on the show. Good question. I'm a journalist. I studied economics, went into journalism after that, worked at Business Day. I saw you had Peter Bruce on the show the other day. He was an old editor of mine. Then I moved to Hong Kong for a bit, worked for a banking magazine there, moved back to Business Day, did corporate PR for a little bit for Edelman, a US public relations firm. Then I worked in climate communications, which is where I got, if you follow me on Twitter, I'm the annoying climate guy. And now I write for an American investment news company called Markets Group, and do a weekly column for News 24.
Okay, great. And that's exactly why we invited you back. So kind of continue on the conversation we had with Peter Bruce, which we didn't quite resolve exactly what we're talking about, and get back to your kind of climate guy kind of positioning on Twitter, because you're always putting out being someone that's like obviously familiar with both international news and the local state of affairs. I sit here in my very strange sort of overly light room over here because we have a 9-hour power outage today on top of load shedding. This is like an extra bonus of power outage today. So obviously power energy is a huge concern from South Africa from an economic perspective, but obviously also there's the global environmental challenges that's going on. And we wanted to have a conversation with you about what's going on in the world there. Is sustainable energy reality, or is the sort of degrowthy, get used to having less stuff that's more expensive future actually just the reality that we're all going to have to get into? And the reason I want to have this conversation again now is we spoke to Peter Bruce, that was last year. I think there was still people thinking about the light at the end of the tunnel. That was before we sort of got the news from Eskom saying, you know, it's going to be stage 2 load shedding basically forever, get used to it, right? You know, like that's it, like that's the best we can do. And if we're lucky, it'll be stage 2, right? And not just that, you've also seen that this has become a global issue. This is something that I've been talking about for quite a long time, and that people sort of rolled their eyes at, like being so dramatic. But we now have serious, you know, columnists. We have the BBC that has its emergency sort of, you know, scripts written and ready for when the lights go out in Britain again, sort of back to the 1970s. Heard today, like the Ukraine power grid is wobbling, that could go down. We've got Europe rationing hot water ahead of what's predicted to be quite a cold winter. I know my friends sitting there in Berlin and all the rest of it are quite concerned about their fancy new apartments that don't have gas pipelines anymore, right? It's like how are they going to get through this winter? So it's becoming a global conversation. It's not just a South African thing, as with South Africa, as with the world. The energy crunch, and I think that's the right way to put it, because it's the degrowth thing, the having to do with less, and it's the sustainability issues. So where economics and environmentalism collide. Maybe you can just give us a couple of words as to the topic, as to where you see things at the moment and where you see them headed. And that's quite a broad question, so take it whichever direction you like.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that you bring up the concept of degrowth. I think firstly, it's not an easy sell. No one wants to think of having to use less.
Popular. Vote for me, you'll get this stuff and it's more expensive.
And to be honest, I actually don't think that that's on the cards at all, because sort of taking out the entire old backbone of the world economy, being fossil energy, and replacing that with cleaner sources, is the investments required are outrageous, like nothing we've ever been through before as a planet. And the amount of sort of stimulus
and the price tag, right? Like that's not on the posters.
Well, we'll get there. It all results in savings down the line. But so the point is that the amount of investment that's going to go into the world economy for the shift is just going to boost growth for a long time, for decades to come. So I actually think the whole concept of talking about degrowth is very premature. I think maybe that's a conversation for a couple of decades time.
There's transitionary degrowth already happening. I don't think it's a prediction. It's a reality. I mean, like, but that's what you can talk about, things like inflation. You can talk about sort of the shrinking middle class. I think a lot of these things people are feeling right now. But the question is whether it's transitory, whether it's sort of like a post-COVID hangover, or whether it is a longer term thing that people will have to get used to. And what I do find quite interesting, having traveled a bit this year particularly to two different places, I went to Republica in Berlin, and then I went to the Dubai Futures Forum, obviously in the UAE. And it was two very different visions of the world. They're both future-orientated conferences. Republica was all about, we have to get into degrowth, donut economics, you've got to make do with less. The middle class is already awful capitalists, and you've all got to cut back. And the future is going to be more hands-on and less stuff. And we should get used to that and try not to be too sad about it. And that was 3 days of not one person challenging that worldview at all. And then you head off to Dubai, and it's a burn baby burn world there, like 3 cars for every family, every person gets their own chauffeur, there's like no energy constraints there, and their view of the future, it's very, very optimistic. So they're talking about biotech and space travel, all very intensive like endeavors if you get into how they're planning on doing it, and it's all optimism all the way. So the truth is probably somewhere in between those two worldviews. I think that the challenge comes in as to what choices we make, or particularly our politicians make, whether they will sort of saddle essentially the middle classes with a more constraint-based or a more abundance-based future going forward. And that's not to say either of those ways are particularly sustainable. I think that's also quite interesting. That there's nothing very sustainable about sustained degrowth either. That's not evolutionary fit. It's not sustainable, ironically, but neither is growth at all costs. So it's a really tricky mess that we kind of got ourselves into. And not only that, nobody really agrees on the way forward. This is a global challenge, but it has to be executed with local solutions, right? So even if Germany does literally turn the power off for its population over the winter and say, use blankets instead of electricity, good luck for that. There was that very infamous op-ed, I think, in the UK too, where one of the politicians said the middle classes should get used to not having electricity on demand, right? Is that the kind of way, or do you kind of put it from a different perspective, right? It's like how do we find a balance there that actually is sustainable?
Yeah. So I actually think, sorry, this may be not answering your question very directly, but I do think this could sort of decentralization of energy, where there's massive uptake of, even in the UK and parts of Europe, of rooftop solar. And obviously those countries are really not amazingly suited to rooftop solar. And we're seeing the same happen here. So sort of people taking, for a kind of lame jargony term, but taking back the power a bit. And I think that's quite an important thing, because consumers will become prosumers of energy and start feeding back into the grid, and being able to make a bit of income off that, hopefully in the future, especially if they have batteries tied to their solar systems. So I do think some very positive things could come out of this. Another positive is that obviously the fastest new generation capacity you can add to the grid to solve the crisis in the UK and Europe is solar and wind energy, because, well, firstly, no one there's talking about adding new coal power plants, and anyway, it would take too long. There is a debate about whether nuclear is the right way to go, or are going big on nuclear, and that's great. The problem obviously is that it takes a good decade to build, at least in Western economies. France and the US tend to take a long time with their nuclear plants, so that stuff's not going to come online anytime soon. So in terms of resolving the problem as fast as possible, it's pretty clear that solar, wind, and batteries are the fastest way to go. So I do think some good is going to come out of this, actually. So I'm kind of optimistic on that front. And European leaders have pushed quite aggressively to speed up the transition because of this on a single source of gas, and actually relying on something to burn for your energy is pretty pretty vulnerable to supply issues, supply disruptions, and things which we're seeing now.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. That's sort of, as you pointed out, the decentralizing of these problems, which is, I think, quite an interesting macro trend at the moment, that for many of the big infrastructure challenges, governments are kind of throwing up their hands. I mean, even here in South Africa, we've got like a 50% now, I think, in Joburg water leakage out of our water system. So, well, dams are full, our taps still aren't, right? But you blame the people and you're like, rather set up JoJo tanks in your house because we actually just not going to fix this. We've also had like notifications from municipal councillors like, guys, we're not actually going to fix the potholes anymore. We just made a decision not to. Like, good luck. So sort of like completely decentralizing the core roles of government, but at the same time, you've got other macro trends towards governments putting a lot, actually be more controlling and more centralizing with softer issues, right? Which is very, very interesting, because we've kind of got those sort of those anti-government criticism bills, whatever you want to call them, as I call them, sort of skeleton key laws, which deal with offense or with being naughty, saying naughty things without sort of defining those things against people in authority, rolling out across the world. I mean, we've got one here in South Africa, we've got the online harms bill in the UK, there's similar ones in the US, we've got anti-blasphemy laws in the EU. So I think it's quite an interesting parallel trend that on the one hand, governments are like, okay, actually you guys can decentralize the hard work, but meanwhile, we'll keep ourselves busy with, you know, policing words in politics, which is very, very interesting to see how governments are dealing or not actually dealing with these crises. And I think it's not just, again, a South African thing. I think there's a kind of global trend there. I think that probably the bigger exceptions there would be the likes of China, who have different sorts of plans. And even there at their current policy meetings, about delaying the switch to renewable energies until they are more cost effective and all the rest of it. They're taking quite a different strategic approach, as China is wont to do, and as they can. It's their prerogative. But what are your thoughts on that? On like, are governments losing control of governing stuff?
I just want a quick note on China. So they are by far the world's biggest investor in solar and wind energy by a country mile. But yeah, they are still adding new coal as well. Anyway,
interesting. A bit of everything.
That's a side note. And government losing control. That's actually a really good observation. I fully agree. Governments taking over the softer, easier stuff that gives them control of the kind of things we
workers.
Yes, exactly. Control of the things we don't want them to control. And then devolving power on the things that they're incapable of doing themselves, which is interesting. And I mean, really good on the latter. I do think kind of taking back, moving things towards sort of community ownership of power and water can be good. The only problem is it leaves a lot of people behind, because not everyone can afford a JoJo tank. Not everyone can afford solar panels on their roof. So it has the potential to increase inequality if there aren't specific sort of levers in place to make sure that it's equitable. So things like, and this has been done in other countries. So the UK has been quite good at solar cooperatives. In the early days when the UK was trying to encourage rooftop solar to take off, they put extremely attractive feed-in tariff incentives in place. So groups would sort of crowd-fund a solar installation on a rooftop in an affordable housing area, just purely to use that empty rooftop space. Then they would give the people in that house free electricity and make their money from feeding electricity back into the grid. So it can be done. It can be done in a way that's really equitable and expands access to all these kinds of things. But there is a risk that, and especially in South Africa, where we don't have the most switched on government, let's put it that way. There's a risk that it could increase inequality, and you have the middle class having a sort of great life, being off-grid almost, and others being reliant on increasingly worse centralized services. So that is a risk, and it unfortunately is largely in government's hands to put the right sort of incentives in place to make sure that it's not doesn't increase inequality.
Yeah, because that's always the trade-off with governance. Basically, you've got the Leviathan or the state of nature, right? And the Leviathan suits the weak and the state of nature suits the strong. And like decentralization suits the strong and the rich, whether you're talking about cryptocurrencies or whether you're talking about gated communities with private policing and private schools, you know, the waterfall state feudal societies that we have all over South Africa. It's fine for the middle classes and for the wealthy. It's a very different scenario. Even what you're talking about there with like public crowdfunding rooftop spaces in the UK, that's not actually possible if you're living in an informal settlements in South Africa. What rooftop space are you talking about exactly, right? Like this is a very different sort of reality here. But that plays out again. It's a global thing. Like whether you're talking about sort of defunding the police in the US or decentralizing the grid in South Africa, these are things that have very different. They're luxury values, right? They might be expensive, but they're very empowering. So if you're on one side of the line, on the other side of the line, you're sort of going to bear the brunt of these great sounding ideas. And that's something we've got to question as a society. Like, what is the point of our social contract, right? Like our social contract was, you know, we pay some money and in exchange we get some safety and security and water on tap, right? You know, like even in vulnerable areas. But those things aren't necessarily going to come forward, and that kind of makes us question, I think, again, the role of what government is planning on being in the future. We talk about businesses having to be survival of the fittest and play in a competitive field, and if you don't deliver better value than your competitors do for your customers, unless you have a government-backed monopoly, which is where all unfairness in the marketplace comes from, that's a different conversation for a different day. You know, like you will lose your position. Whereas a government, if it is handing off a lot of its basic services, handing it back to the public, but it's not really replacing that with other value, we do kind of question those things. And that kind of brings me to the other topic I wanted to talk to you about today, because it's arriving here in South Africa, and it's again, it depends on how cynical you are and how far ahead in the future you all want to think about these things. But something that's arrived here now is voluntary surveillance for again the rich and the privileged. Speaking specifically here about carbon credit scores, but personal carbon credit scores, which is something companies have had obviously for a very long time. There's tax incentives behind them, but there's lots of signals in the trends future space where I'm in that these sort of carbon credits and carbon taxes and carbon fines are coming to individuals too. First voluntarily, first is a right, and it says a responsibility or a privilege, right? And if you try to book a flight, it shows you, do you want to pay even more money to offset your carbon emissions? You're like, wait a minute, isn't the airline already doing that? Like, don't they say those things already? Like, this is total nonsense. Like, why am I paying twice? But anyway, when we don't ask those sorts of questions, it makes us feel nice and virtuous at the Checkers or the Woolworths queue to print out our till slip and see what our carbon points are. And those systems and scoring systems are coming here now. What are your thoughts on that, on actually as a way to improve climate sustainability? I'm also trained in economics. I have huge questions about the viability of any of these incentive or punishment, stick or carrot-based systems. I think they create massive externalities and perverse incentives further down the line. But what are your thoughts on them? Do you think they're helpful or harmful in the long run?
It's a really it's a really tough one. I mostly agree with you. I do think, so firstly, there was that, and I'm always hesitant of conspiracy theories because they're often just an easy way to sort of explain things and reinforce your existing worldviews. Anyway, this isn't a conspiracy theory. It's actually real. And I think it was, well, I think it was the 90s or 2000s where BP and the big fossil fuel companies were looking for ways to sort of deflect blame. So their PR agencies said, well, you just need to tell people they need to worry about their own carbon footprint, and then it shifts the blame from you. You can keep doing what you're doing because then it's all on the consumer. It's the consumer's choices. That's they don't have to take a flight if they don't want to, because so that is one big.
We do this with like affirmative action to bigger companies push it down the supply chain to the SME that has literally 2 employees. Like, how do you meet that quota guy? You know, that's work out. And you got 4 different racial groups you got to cover for, right? So yes, that already happens. The incentive is there to pass that cost on to the weakest person in the link.
Yeah, so I have a problem with it from that perspective. I think it's just a sort of extension of what the fossil fuel companies started to deflect blame from themselves. On the other hand, I mean, if it's purely voluntary and stays that way, I think they can be helpful. They can.
Counting your own calories, to being conscious about what you consume, right?
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
that.
And I mean,
yeah, carry on.
So I was just going to say, if you're sort of buying carbon credits for carbon intensive goods while you're online shopping or something, and it is going into a genuine sort of offset program, most of them are not genuine. If it is going into
most of that goes to pay salaries for rich people.
Yeah, exactly. So if it is going to a genuine sort of offset program, then great. I mean, I don't see it really taking off in South Africa. I think it's a tough sell because people have so many other things to worry about. But I don't see a problem with that. The sort of concept in general of pushing the responsibility of these things onto the consumer, that's not great.
Yeah, I suppose it is one thing if you take it for yourself and it's voluntary, but the point is that all this is data that's being tracked and traced, and it's being accumulated, and it's being shared with your insurer. I mean, we all know, we all live in the world. We know what insurers do with what your credit card purchases and all the rest of it, and with the various and with your banks and all the rest of it. So when these sorts of point systems start to have a material impact on your credit worthiness, in terms of your access to goods and services, then it becomes once again a regressive tax, right? I mean, it's the same thing. Like, I can use an example from like the world of fast fashion, right? So if you're wealthy, it's quite easy to buy a completely carbon neutral, pure cotton and silk, cardigan to swan around your house with during COVID, right? But if you're poorer, you're buying clothes based on the price ticket, and it comes with a higher carbon price tag. It's probably made in a sweatshop somewhere in the East that you don't know about, and it ends up in a dump, and it's made out of plastic. But like, if you're wealthier, that's a choice. If you're poor, it's not a choice. And I always look at like margins too. Again, the flight thing is quite an interesting one, right? Like, if the price of your tickets goes up a bit more because the airline's passing their carbon credit costs onto you as the consumer, it cuts a whole lot of people out of global mobility, which is one of the easiest ways to reduce inequality, right? So being able to participate in global mobility, so it pushes. It pushes the sort of the underclass just further, makes them kind of more invisible, and everyone else kind of feels virtuous at the top. I'm just not sure about how these things scale, other than just being a sort of punitive tax on the less fortunate in societies. And there's of course the other sort of creepier things that can come with it, where if then your bank, insurer, or even your government starts to want access to that carbon credit score and can use it for fining individuals, much like we fine companies already. And of course the logic is already there, right? So I mean, if we are fining companies for overextending their carbon budgets, of course there's no sort of moral or legal sort of real line that says you can't justify doing the same thing on an individual basis, right? And there, it's not just the cost and the fact that wealthy people can switch to more sustainable goods and actually use them as status symbols, and for people who don't really have the luxury to switch to different things. It's also the increased layer of control, because there is pretty much nothing that we do, including breathing, because breathing also involves carbon, that doesn't have a carbon footprint attached to it. So there's like, it's a huge like piece of strengthening, right? Like, where do you stop monitoring people? It's easy to monitor a company because you can look at balance sheets, but when you start pushing that down the chain, and companies start pushing onto their employees or onto their customers, or governments start pushing onto their citizens instead of onto their ministers, there's very little that you can justify not tracking in terms of what people put, where they move.
Fair enough.
It becomes quite a creepy conversation as to where we draw the line between greater good and sort of individual right to privacy, freedom of movement, freedom of speech, all of those sorts of things. So I don't know. I think these are things that sound really innocent at first blush, when you think about how they're used and how power incentives play out, and about how everyone's looking for someone to blame. Again, come back to Johannesburg and Rand Water, blaming everyone from consumers drinking water to Eskom not putting out the power for the fact that half their water falls out of their pipes because they can't plug the holes, right? Like, everyone looks for someone to blame, and 100%. That's us. We're the end of the line.
Human beings, that's how we work.
That's how we work.
Yeah. I wanted to say something on that, and I've just drawn a blank. Sorry.
Yeah, that's on the carbon credit scores and pushing it onto people. I mean, there's more there. Like in terms of, I think the pushing it down to employees, I think it sort of illustrates this scenario quite nicely. What happened in COVID in parts of the EU. I think Scotland was one of the countries that there were a couple of others I've kind of forgotten now, where companies understood when employees started working remotely, right? Now that remote working employees' carbon footprint is part of the company's package now, depending on whether that employee has double glazed windows or not, so how far away they work from the office or if they're commuting or not. That started becoming something like putting sort of like carbon surveillance in employees' homes, along with the sort of work time surveillance, like they were putting cameras in people's bathrooms to make sure they weren't spending too much time on a bathroom break if you're working for some of those big international tech companies. Now they also want to know how you get to work, what your house is like, having a company inspector come in and check your double glazing so that the company can claim your credit points and like push it on to the government. That's at the corporate level, right? So they're like, why wouldn't the state want to get in on that action too, right? That's a lot easier than actually, turning the lights on or building a new power plant, whatever the case is.
I mean, on the one hand, I mean, I completely get you, and I see the downsides. And to be honest, it's not something I've actually thought about much. So, but there are also some upsides to it. It does drive behavior, as in using that Scotland example. People will start thinking, okay, maybe I should cycle to work if it's a nice day or something, or live a little bit closer to work and have double glazing so that I don't need to heat my house quite as much. So it can have positive sort of knock-ons. I do get you though on the potential downside, and I also, like I said earlier, really don't think the idea of pushing responsibility onto the consumer is the right way to do it. That said, though, on carbon credits and carbon sort of markets, they will unfortunately have a massive role to play in decarbonizing the world economy, just because if you don't put a price on carbon, then there's no incentive for anyone.
Go on. Yes, that's true. If you don't put a price on the externality, then it just
exactly.
Then we're not counting for the proper cost of goods. That's pure economics. That makes a lot of sense. However,
and if there's not a price in carbon, then there's no incentive for carbon capture and quite important things like that, which we will need to stabilize the climate. So there's always trade-offs and perverse incentives. It's an interesting one. I don't know what the right answer is actually.
No, but then again, with the carbon, the whole carbon market system, I have huge questions about it, in that pricing carbon and like actually sort of giving people carbon licenses or having to pay back to the common good is one thing. But like markets for carbon offsets and carbon trading is probably one of the creepiest things I've ever heard of, because that actually incentivizes more carbon production. That speaks to the fact that companies are given a carbon endowment, like it's actually okay to burn through this amount of carbon rather than setting carbon endowment at zero and charging for all of it. I mean, like when you hear about how Elon Musk actually got rich, like selling carbon offsets basically by getting companies to invest in Tesla sort of solar panels or whatever, cars or whatever, it's absolutely disgusting. Like the little guy again is subsidizing massive private wealth consumption by creating a market for something there shouldn't be a market for. I think there's a very big difference between having a carbon market and having carbon costs or extra pricing from costing externalities. I think we've made a massive mistake in making these things tradable. I know that many economists would disagree with me, but like I've met people. But I've met a few of them.
And I mean, on the other side of that, a lot of the carbon offset projects are just such a scam, to be quite honest. A lot of them are just okay, we have a forest, give us some of your carbon credits and we'll make sure it stays here. How is that? It's basically just protecting something that is there anyway. It doesn't make a lot of sense. So there's a long way to go in sorting these things out. And I mean, it could end up just going down the wrong path. It's very possible.
And what are your thoughts on the eco-extortion thing that certain, especially third world governments? Again, we've spoken about the injustice of a lot of these things, how the costs are passed on to the weakest individual, but they also tend to be passed on to the weakest countries. In that it's one thing for Germany to want to decarbonize and to put like very stringent carbon restrictions onto companies and how they work. It's quite different when Germany applies those same standards to a developing market. That adds cost. All these things are essentially luxuries. They added costs to the cost of goods. And if you're a country that's sort of scrambling to sort of meet the bread line, you know, these costs might be prohibitive. It's the difference between people going to bed hungry and not going to bed hungry on a very literal basis. So you have the likes of some of the countries, I think like Ghana, or of course South America too, with the Amazon rainforest, essentially extorting richer nations and saying like, we will burn down this forest or we will not protect it unless you pay us, right? Again, these incentives just play off in very different ways. People don't usually frame it that way, but I'm not really employed, so I can say. But like that's also what's happening. We're kind of creating like this hostage situation over a lot of the natural world or the common good. I don't know. How do you avoid that? Is it possible?
So there's another way of looking at that, and Gambia. So Norway's paying Gambia a massive amount of money to protect its forests, which I kind of think is maybe the right way to do it. They're saying
at the same time, it's like it's pricing something that maybe shouldn't be priced, right? It's like imagine a parent said that to like the States, like, I'll only protect my kid if you pay me. Like
well, I guess they're paying them because they're giving up an opportunity cost of demolishing those forests and putting factories in place. I guess the question is whether they're paying them a fair compensation price. I mean, on the one hand, Norway is taking this on themselves. They're taking one for the rest of the world. So that's kind of fair. I guess they can't be expected to pay.
So it's a free trade. They decided to do that.
On a sort of different segment of the same topic is the whole concept of carbon border taxes, which unfortunately now is very necessary, but it's very unfair. We've just got to the point where we don't have much of a carbon budget left to play with. Economies like the EU are putting very strict carbon taxes on their companies. So to avoid leakage, where those manufacturing companies just say, okay, well, we'll just go set up a factory in South Africa rather, because they don't have severe carbon taxes. So that way we can just manufacture stuff there, import it back into the EU, and we circumvent the taxes. So it has to kind of happen, the carbon border taxes. Otherwise, everyone will just externalize their manufacturing and avoid carbon taxes. But at the same time, it's unfair. So because South Africa is a very carbon intense economy, the most carbon intense in the G20, just because we use way more coal than pretty much anyone else. A lot of our exports are at huge risk, and that includes our cars, pretty much a lot of our big export items, including aluminium, because of the carbon content of the stuff we produce here. So that's pretty unfair. It's necessary, but unfair. And I don't know what the solve for that is, but it's an issue.
It is. I suppose it also is also one of those other things that irritates me no end when very virtuous, generally sort of, middle class, wealthy people want to rail against the evil petro companies and say they're the problem, but forgetting that for every supply there's like a demand, right? Like, and we can't single out certain countries, we can't single out certain businesses because we're part of a complex economy. You can't say it's like, it's Shell and BP that are running the world. Meanwhile, you drive a car, you wear plastic clothes, you shop at Patagonia. I love that video, by the way. If you haven't seen it, you must go look it up, where the CEO of one of the big oil companies went on a complete rant at Patagonia, who had very virtuously said they wouldn't be like, like they were the petro companies were totally evil, and they went through their website and just pointed out all the items on their website that were made with stuff that came from companies. We're like, we're all part of the problem, right? And it's completely too easy to pick out scapegoats, which kind of comes full circle back to the consumption side of things. So maybe then the personal carbon credits are the fairest way to look at that, right? Isn't that the most regressive taxable? It could be progressive. It's regressive if it's implemented the way it would be now, generally on buying food, but it could be very progressive if it was built on stopping people from flying private jets or for doing exorbitant things, which is again something that I love to sort of follow, particularly when they looked at carbon taxes on transport. They exempted luxury yachts, like this is exactly what you should be doing, right? Like I love the irony here. I love the way everyone sort of points fingers, but no one wants to look at those.
Completely. I think where this comes back to is the role of government at the end of the day, which unfortunately we're not in good hands there. And government is a good lever at sort of pushing change, because it can incentivize new industries, and it could incentivize sort of alternatives. So governments have subsidized fossil fuel companies for 100 years plus. Government, like with government help, Tesla got off the ground. Governments are very powerful sort of kickstarters of new industries and alternatives. And I think that's where governments could play a big role in stimulating things like alternative building materials, new clean energy and things like that. Again, we unfortunately in the hands of a not great entity being government.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. That's another one that I'm not completely settled on, that government incentives or investments, whether you want to call them moonshots, like some of those celebrity economists like to talk about them, are actually the way to solve this. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious in the South African case study. I know that, but we're not speaking for the whole world here, that government actually just needs to do less. It just needs to get the hell out of the way to relax its own monopoly, which means doing nothing. It actually has to do nothing. Just don't do anything. Don't worry about it. You don't want to do anything. It's cool. Just like, relax the monopoly, allow people to have generators without, they want to tax generators, they want to give you a solar panel license. Like, that's it. Like, stop making work. Like, don't do that. Actually, just allow people to generate electricity and sell it. I mean, there's like business models waiting to copy paste from other places in the world. People just can't do a lot of these problems. So I'm not convinced that the government's investing in grand projects is going to solve us here. And then in fact, the market works quite well, especially with these messy problems if you get out the way. And if you price those externalities, as you say, that creates new markets immediately, but without doing any more work.
And fair enough. I think we're already sort of at a tipping point where in the early days, you probably need some government support and subsidies and maybe tax incentives when the technology is immature, but it no longer is. Especially on renewable energy side, it very much can stand on its own without any need for government subsidies. So probably should. But yeah, sorry, you've just given me an idea on how badly we price things, not just carbon.
So badly. Even the price of carbon we have at the moment is not priced right, because we've been subsidizing that for so long. That's half the problem, right? Like, in fact, it's interfering in the market that's caused almost all the problems. Like, it's not priced correctly because we've been covering those costs. Same thing with food, right? And this sort of piles up in the longer run and creates problems. Like now you want to, put disincentives to stop people eating meat, but meanwhile you've been subsidizing cows. I mean, like, it's like, it makes no sense.
I know. And I mean, one other one, which is the toughest one, is water. Government subsidizes water, and water is actually too cheap. It means we don't look after it properly. We just sort of, while we're brushing our teeth, we leave the tap running or something like that. I don't.
Yeah.
But
these things we do for good intentions. Like you got to understand people are involved. People.
Yeah, exactly.
But that's it. Run with it.
Exactly. But that said, you can't obviously suddenly jack up the price of water because
this is the reality we faced with.
Yeah.
You have to phase people into it, right?
Yeah. I think the biggest thing though is just how inadequately priced carbon is. Again, though, where do you push those prices onto that? It all becomes, it's a big mess. Everything's just a big mess, and it's very hard to unravel and price things correctly.
Because it's not simple. I think that's where a lot of the conversations around these sorts of issues fall down. It's if you try to find a scapegoat, like that's the bad guy, but it's the whole system. It's designed in a fragile way.
Yeah, completely. I do think, I mean, obviously fossil fuel companies need to take a lot of blame. Firstly, for sort of since the 70s misleading the public about emissions and exactly. I think that's where they need to take the most responsibility and blame, is playing down the severity of the climate crisis. Firstly, by sort of denying there was a problem, even though their own scientists repeatedly found that there was. And then secondly, hiring PR companies, and I've sort of been involved in this in myself and had to step away from it, hiring PR companies to pretend that they're very green and that they've made a complete 180 and they're now very clean companies and saving the world, whereas they're really not. So I think they do need to take a huge amount of blame, but it's not just them. They're beneficiaries again of other unfair gains. Like again, they've been subsidized by governments for ages. Like a lot of these subsidies are not like direct cash transfers, although in many countries they are. It's also monopoly rights over shared natural resource endowments, right? I mean, this is where I think most of the injustice of the world comes from, in that we think that we have a right to shared assets, that someone has a right to own it forever, or to that doesn't check out. Like that's right.
And
another one on the sort of bad pricing is now in Europe and the UK, they're subsidizing gas prices, which is kind of necessary because the cost of living is spiraling out of control, but then they are it's not an accurate reflection of the externalities and the costs anymore, and it delays action if gas prices are still affordable. And people think, well, we may as well just stick on gas. So really tough to get this right. I mean, you can't not step in when the cost of living is getting out of hand.
No, but then again, I don't know, maybe you have to step away, because it's the same thing with like, well, I know it's on the micro level and it's hard, and you take the cost now, it's a lesser cost later down the line. It's would you rather sort of be stabbed or have a slow death from a cancer or something, right? I mean, like, you know, depending on who you ask, it just depends on how that answer will land. But it's
I'd take a stabbing any day for sure.
Yeah, me too. Like I'd rather take the cost now and understand, actually, maybe I have been living above my means, and in fact my whole society has, and you know, then you can get into a new growth cycle once you've actually paid the old cost. But it's the same thing with our sort of, you know, our perma banking crisis now, because we keep bailing out banks, they don't get better. So the perma crisis rolls on. Like, you know, we actually have to take that knock at some point.
No, that's a very good point. Fully agree.
We have overeaten that endowment, very literally.
100%. Fully agree. And I think well, part of the reason the UK government is so keen to step in and reduce gas prices is because, well, Liz Truss's new government wants new gas, so
there's a political motivation there. They didn't have to do it. I reject that point wholesale. And what I do think is, and what would happen if the government didn't subsidize those points, is then Labour would have more power. Labour already has more power at the moment because less people want to work, quite frankly. Like, you know, like the Labour has very good bargaining power at the moment. We could get better wages through there, and that cost will be pushed on to the people who have larger profit margins. You know, that cost would find its way up the food chain. It will be sort of trickle up. At the moment, actually subsidizing gas prices is subsidizing corporate profits, in my opinion, if you look far enough down there.
100%.
Doesn't feel that way, but it is. Same with UBI. We can have that conversation. Subsidizing corporate profits.
Very interesting way of looking at it. I've gone cold on UBI. It was interesting for a while, but anyway. Sorry, that's rejected that idea.
Rejected it hard, but people are going to come back. Short-termism.
Sorry, I've gone on a tangent there, but just going sort of full circle, I think the decentralization of these things is a really interesting inflection point. And there was something I wanted to mention earlier, which was you mentioned we can't put solar panels on informal housing, and you're absolutely correct. There are some quite sort of interesting solutions coming out in Hout Bay. There's a Green Cape, is a non-profit organization in the Western Cape. They've started doing a sort of solar as a service operation. Well, they're backing it, they're involved in it, where you put up solar panels on sort of poles, and you feed electricity into communities that never had electricity, the sort of last ones that have never been connected, into their shacks, basically, and power essentials. And that's a sort of crowdfunded model. There are quite a few of those sort of crowdfunding models, decentralized crowdfunding models coming through, which is, I think, quite interesting. There's a company, it's not energy related, but there's a company in Mozambique that's doing sort of crowdfunded affordable housing developments. And they're quite interesting. And it's you'll be able to earn a return on your crowdfunded investment, but a lower one. It's you're doing it more for the impact. Then there's a company based in Cape Town, which I talk about quite a lot just because I think they're quite fascinating, called the Sun Exchange. And they do decentralized crowdfunding of solar projects for schools and manufacturing plants and farms and things like that. I bought a cell. You can buy just a little cell on a single panel, and then you own that and you lease it to the school. The school pays no upfront costs for the installation. They just pay you a sort of rental fee based on how much electricity your cell produces. You can make a decentish return on it. It's a win-win-win type situation. Again, maybe not. Someone needs to find a way to do it for the poorest of the poor to electrify those communities. But I do think there's some interesting things happening in the private sector in terms of decentralization.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a pretty good point to end this very rambling conversation. Sorry, and welcome to the small print. This is what we do. And thank you very much, Nick, for your time. Where can people find you if they want to continue this conversation, hire you to, I don't know, speak at a conference, whatever the case is?
So Twitter is where I spend too much of my time. You can find me on Twitter, or pretty much just there, to be honest. Or you can read my weekly column in News 24. Where I'm
great. What's it called? Does it have a title?
No, just says Nick Hedley, but it's solutions focused. I'm trying to not be negative and purely focus on solutions and opportunities. So if anyone has any opportunities, please let me know.
I'm trying to tell people optimism is a moral duty because expectations actions,
Agreed.
right? Like they change.
Agreed.
I don't want to come to that realization, but I did. So now I have to talk about it. I wish there was like a moral imperative to just be cynical all day, but there's not. So let's end on an optimistic note.
I've been both an optimist and a cynic at the same time my whole life, and it's quite being pulled in both directions at the same time. It's quite exhausting.
It's a good balance, right? Everyone needs the two wolves, right?
Yeah.
Nothing wrong with that. But thank you so much, Nick. It's an absolute pleasure.
Thanks, Bronwyn. Much appreciated. Interesting chat.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and rate us on all your preferred podcast platforms. If you'd like to find out more about what we're doing, please join our Substack community via the link in the comments below. And as always, we'd love to hear your suggestions for future guests and conversation topics.